So, good evening and welcome to Basic Income Ireland's webinar on Universal Basic Income and the Labour Movement in Ireland. It's a great pleasure to be running this event and to have our three speakers who've made time available. In order of appearance on the agenda, it's Guy Standing and Tom McDonnell and Michael Taft. We'll do a little more of an intro to them in a moment. I'm just going to run through the order of business for this evening. We will have, following the introductions, we will have a 15-minute presentation discussion from each of the speakers, starting with Guy, followed by Tom, and finished off by Michael. We'll then open to questions and comments, aiming for that to be around 7 o'clock. And we'll go around the room and take those as one set of questions, comments. And then we'll ask the speakers to give their responses to the comments or questions. Because Guy's joining from a different time zone, we'll ask him to maybe give his response first, and then we will aim to have a wrap up at about 19:25, coming up to 6:30, and finish the meeting at 7:30. So that's the plan for the evening. And I'll hand over, the evening is being hosted by Brad McPherson. He's Secretary of Basic Income Ireland, sitting behind the scenes trying to keep us all going technically. And I'll hand over to my joint coordinator now, Philomena Murphy, who's going to do the introductions to the speakers. Over to you, Philomena.
Thank you, Bobby. I suppose before I introduce our speakers, I'm just going to briefly describe what basic income, universal basic income is. I'm sure most of you are already familiar with the concept of universal basic income, but this is just in case there's some new people joining us. And universal basic income is the idea that the state should give a regular payment to every individual resident, regardless of their circumstances and without a means test or work requirement. This basic income would be enough to live a frugal but decent life without adequate income supports. There are many reasons why this would be beneficial for society, such as providing a regular income for those currently not supported by the social welfare system. For example, those in care work, third-level students, and those in precarious zero-hour contract employment. And UBI could also help eliminate poverty traps found with the current system, plus provide greater leverage for workers, since they could voluntarily leave an unsuitable job and still have a guaranteed source of income. And I'm now going to introduce our three guest speakers for the evening. And first off, we have Professor Guy Standing, Tom McDonnell, and Michael Taft. Our first speaker, Professor Guy Standing, and he is one of the co-founders of Basic Income Earth Network, or BN. He is also the honorary co-president of BN and has authored several books on UBI and the precariat and has worked for the International Labour Organization for many years. Our second speaker, Tom McDonnell, is co-director for the Nevin Economic Research Institute, and he holds a PhD in economics from the University of Galway. And our final speaker, Michael Taft, is an economic researcher for Ireland's largest trade union, SIPTU. He's also the author of the political economy blog, Notes from the Front. I'm just going to hand you over to Guy, and we'll get started.
Well, thank you very much. And I wish I were with you physically, as it were. It's always been a great pleasure to come to Ireland. As Sean Healy knows, we've been campaigning and talking about it. We had a wonderful BII Congress in Dublin, and it's the sort of country where you could imagine a coalition of forces coming together to make a campaign for basic income. And I want to address our union friends in particular in my remarks. First of all, the justification for basic income, whether it's high or low or somewhere in between, is fundamentally ethical. It's not instrumental. Yes, it would reduce poverty. Yes, it would reduce inequality. It would have other economic effects that I will mention later. But fundamentally, the reason for supporting a basic income is threefold. First, it is a matter of common justice. The income and wealth of every single one of us is far more to do with the efforts and achievements of the numerous generations that went before us. But we don't know whose ancestors contributed more or less. And if you allow for a system of private inheritance of private riches, then you could see a basic income as a sort of common dividend on the collective public wealth that's been accumulated. I'm reminded that H.A. Simon, who was a Nobel Prize-winning economist, and he calculated that 80% of our income is due to society rather than anything we do ourselves. And Warren Buffett admitted just the same. So I think it's a matter of common justice, and I derive the support on this principle to the Charter of the Forest of November 1217. And what that did, it said the commons belong to everybody as commoners. And there should be reparations for enclosure and other ways that the commons are taken. Modern parlance, privatization, commodification, and so on. And the poor, throughout our history, whether it be in Ireland or Britain or anywhere else, have always relied on the commons in some sense to give them what was called the poor's overcoat. It enhanced basic security. Now, if you think of justice, you also think of religious justice. Religious justice is based on the principle that God has given unequal talents. I'm not religious, but many people in Ireland are, and I respect that. And they can understand that in a sense, basic income would be compensating those who have not been given by nature or by God the talents to make money. I think that's a worthy principle. And I think that the Pope earlier this year recognized that in his fantastic letter, where he came out in support of a basic income. It's also a matter of ecological justice, because we need carbon taxes. We need wealth taxes. We need land value taxes if we're going to get an ecologically balanced society. The trouble with carbon taxes is that they are regressive by themselves. In other words, the poor pay a higher percentage of their income than the rich with a carbon tax. The only way to make them politically popular and politically equitable is to say that revenue will be recycled to every commoner, every legal resident of the country. I think that principle of justice is fundamental. We should always emphasize that. Those who believe in a basic income system start on that point. The second and related thing is that a basic income, again, even if it's low to start with, below what you would expect to give you a decency, well below that, which is what's the likelihood to start with. It's going to enhance people's basic security. A basic security is a public good. It's also a superior public good. A public good is one that if you have it, it doesn't deprive me of having it. But in fact, a superior public good is that if we all have it, the value of that security increases for everybody. Now, basic security is a matter that the psychologists understand is a human need. And you cannot expect people who are chronically insecure to be able to make rational long-term decisions or to show a sense of social responsibility. It's unfair of us to expect that. Of course, we hope that's the case. But basic security has also been shown to increase mental bandwidth. If people in the precariat, about which I've written a lot, are suffering from insecurity, their mental bandwidth shrinks. they suffer from an inability to control time. And they make wrong decisions because they are insecure. So we need basic security. The third ethical reason is that it would enhance freedom. Every politician, everybody says, we believe in freedom. But you can't be free if you're insecure and you have to do what any bureaucrat or anybody else tells you what to do. You can't, you're not free. Freedom starts with the ability to say no. And in our pilots around the world, this sentiment comes through every time, particularly among women. Women can move out of abusive relationships. Women can stand on their own more forcibly. And this sense of freedom goes with the freedom to make choices. That's why Milton Friedman understood a basic income, because he said, well, if you want a rational market economy, people must have situations where they can be rational. I accept that. I'm not on the right, I'm on the left. But that, I think, is a good argument. But you also enhance liberal freedom. The liberal freedom is the freedom to be moral. You can't be moral if you're so desperate you have to do whatever is necessary to survive. You can only be moral when you can make decisions yourself and keep to those decisions. That's morality. And I think a basic income, and there's one point that Philomena may not have emphasized as much as I would like, but otherwise I agree with her statement, is that a basic income is fundamentally an individual right. And what we found is that individual right strengthens the collective family orientation, community orientation. If you treat people as equals, they behave more like equals. Now, the argument that unions should support a basic income is not just on these ethical principles, which I think should be fundamental for anybody who claims to be on the left politically, but also because it strengthens the bargaining position of workers and potential workers. I was giving a talk on basic income several years ago to a summer school of European trade union leaders, including several from Ireland. And I said, why is it that so few unions support a basic income? At that point, the chair, an elderly unionist, said, okay, we'll adjourn this session and we'll have a coffee break. So I thought, oh, okay, you're not answering. Okay, fair enough. So we went off the coffee break. When we came back, I started putting my papers together because he said, we're going on to the next session. And an Italian trade union leader at the back of the room stood up and said, please, I think before we conclude, we have to answer Guy's question because it's true. Why are we opposed? I think, he said, that the reason is we feel that if people had basic security, they wouldn't join trade unions. I looked at him and I said, if you think about that for 10 seconds, you will realize how immoral that is. You want people to be in fear. You don't want them to be having security, but you're also wrong. People who are chronically insecure keep their heads down. They're frightened. They've got to survive. But if you give people basic security, they become citizens in the real meaning of the sense. And I think that's very, very important. And also, I believe the unions are in a crisis of their own, and they must transform themselves into agents of an ecological future. And that means moving away from the standard position that they've had for the last 50 years, that when it comes to a choice between jobs and saving the environment, they always go for jobs. We've just seen that with the London airport, etc. Many other cases which I've mentioned in my book. That's not an answer. The answer should be jobs are instrumental. Being in a job is being in a position of subordination to a boss. Why idealize that? It's instrumental, fine, but don't idealize it. What you should be idolizing is giving people basic security and freedom, full freedom. And I think we are at the stage where what's happened in the past year or more with the COVID pandemic is that millions of people around the world are realizing that the biggest challenge before us is how to give society and individuals, every individual's, a sense of resilience, the capacity to absorb shocks and recover from shocks. And that is why I'm really touched. I've done over 100 webinars on basic income in the past year, countries from all over the world. And more people, particularly young people, and if I may say so, particularly young women in the precariat, understand what resilience is all about and how they want to extend and revive resilience. We are in a beautiful position. We may feel depressed, those of us who are advocating it, and I've advocated it for 30 years, but around the world, there are things taking shape. There are 45 cities in the United States of America which today are operating basic income pilots or experiments. I'm working with the Welsh government, which is committed to doing a pilot in Wales. I worked with the Scottish government, which has put money up to design pilots for Scotland. 32 councils across England and Wales have voted, and this is right across the political spectrum, in favor of doing basic income pilots. In places like Korea, we have a presidential candidate leading in the polls who has promised that if he's elected, he will introduce for the whole country what he's done in his own province, a basic income. So for me, this is a fertile moment. I did a video with Massive Attack last year. Hundreds of thousands of people have watched this video. And I get more responses from people who say that resilience point is the key point. And I believe that if unions are going to become a progressive force, which I want, I've been a member of a trade union all my life, and worked for trade unions, then we need to strengthen resilience and have that as our motif. And that's where basic income fits. It's not a panacea. It must be seen as a package. You can cost it and you can do it. You can easily pay for it if you design changes in tax systems as well as ecological taxes. You can pay for it. It's not beyond our possibilities. I've said that in the book, Battling 8 Giants, shown it, given estimates of the costs, etc. So we are at a very interesting point, and I want to encourage every friend in Ireland to not give up hope, but in fact, build hope. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Guy. That's a great run through. I love the emphasis on the morality and the values and the ethical aspects of that. So that's great. I think we'll, as per the agenda, we'll keep going and get the inputs from Tom and Michael, and then be able to open it up to discussion. So lots of food for thought there. So thanks very much, Guy. And now I'll call on Tom to come in there. Tom, please.
Thanks, Bobby. I'm not going to be able to follow Guy's performance there. And the reality is, it's difficult to point to anything that Guy said there that I would disagree with. What I think I can do is maybe look at the context of what the Irish social protection system looks like a little bit. Maybe give a kind of a context regarding costings. Look at some ways it could be paid for, look at some alternatives, and then I think probably the useful thing to do would be to kind of interact then with the questions and kind of have a kind of back and forth on the practicalities of it. Just to say for context as well, that as you all know, there is a relatively new government with a program for government, and there is a commitment to a pilot UBI, and there is discussion about doing something for the arts sector, although in practice I don't think that you will be a universal basic income. I think it will be something slightly different. But there's also been a Commission on Taxation and Welfare, which has just been set up. It's only the fourth in the history of the state, and so that will be looking comprehensively at the Irish taxation system and at the Irish welfare system. So that those meetings and I'm sure consultations will happen over the next year. So we are at a point where these things are being discussed. So just to say that as kind of background, and just to say that I'm on that commission as well myself. So I'll be paying very, very close attention to what Guy and others have to say. So just the context for Ireland is that you'll probably all know this, but we're a very low spender on public expenditure, but overall, second lowest level of per person spending in all of wealthy Western Europe. We spend about 16,500 per person. That's not counting interest rates. The average for wealthy Western European countries would be about 20,000, with a range of 14,500 in the UK to almost 34,000 in Norway. So if Ireland were to move to the European average, we would be looking at an additional close to 17 billion of spending. So it's worth noting at the outset that is the context. Social protection spending in Ireland was about 20.9 billion in 2019, which amounts to about 4,200 per person, and there were about 2.1 million recipients. And for context, the Irish population in 2019 was about 4.9 million, of which 3.9 million were adults. Within social protection spending, pension spending is by far the largest amount at 8.2 billion. This is followed by illness, disability and caring at about 5.5, and then child-related payments at about another 2.7. We have a very youthful population relative to other European countries, and that means their spending on pensions is lower than the other wealthy countries, and that partially explains some of the difference in overall spending. Our social protection schemes are by and large a mix of contributory social insurance-based, and contributory and non-contributory rather. Some of that is means tested social assistance, but some of it is universal. So for example, we have a child benefit payment, which is possibly the closest thing we have to a universal basic payment. But overall, our social protection system is not ideologically consistent in any way. It's very much a hybrid nature. And I suppose the obvious question is whether or not the system is working in terms of its core function, which is reducing poverty and deprivation. Guy obviously mentioned the ethical component, and that's obviously very, very important, and I certainly wouldn't disagree with that. But it's one of its core functions for sure has to be elimination of poverty and deprivation. And Ireland's enforced rate of deprivation in 2019 was 17.8%. So I would say it is not succeeding in its goal. And the deprivation rate for some cohorts was significantly higher. Over 30% for the unemployed, over 40% for those with disabilities or lone parents. People in rented accommodation are much more likely to be in enforced deprivation than people in owner-occupied housing, which perhaps points to other issues. But overall, in my viewpoint is that the system is not succeeding in its core function, given how wealthy Ireland is. And obviously, a core contention of universal basic income adherence is that it would eliminate poverty if it was set high enough. So Guy mentioned setting it at lower rates, and obviously that would be much more affordable. But I thought it might be useful to look at how much it would cost if you set the UBI for every adult at the rate of job seekers allowance. So that's 203 euro. And that would have a gross cost of about 41.2 billion. And then if you had a 100 euro top up for children, let's say, that would be an additional 5.2 billion. Or you could set the UBI even higher. So the Vincentians sometimes talk about 240 euros per week. That would add 7.5 billion to the gross cost. Or to set it at a rate to eliminate poverty of about 280 euros, well, that's adding about 15.5 billion. to the cost. So presumably we would eliminate most existing social protection payments. Ending them all would leave a net cost of close to 25 billion based on a €203 rate and €100 for children. I have no scientific basis for those figures, just the €203 is where job seekers is at. In practice, of course, we would want to retain many secondary benefits, particularly those related to illness, disability, and caring. So you might be looking at a net cost of close to 30 billion. That's about 14% of Ireland's GNI star. GNI star is a proxy measure of Ireland's economic output, because as you will all know, Ireland's GDP is essentially a kind of a makey-uppy figure based upon the tax planning of US multinationals principally. And for context, before the pandemic in 2019, we were running a government surplus of about 0.8% of GNI star, equivalent to about 1.8 billion. And then it's also worth noting that governments can sustainably run deficits. So if we think the economy's growth potential is somewhere between 4% and 5%, then it's certainly the case that we could run average annual deficits of about 3%. The growing economy effectively pays for the deficits. And there is indeed scope for tax increases. So data from Eurostat shows that average annual government revenue in the EU was about 39.1% in 2019. Irish government revenue, even on this lower GNI star basis, was just 36.8%. That means there's a revenue gap of close to 5 billion. The reality is it's probably slightly more than that, because the component of output that's bigger than GNI star would presumably have some fiscal capacity as well. So that still leaves a gap of about half. So the remainder of the shortfall would have to come from higher taxes and social contributions, which I'm not against, or from cuts to public spending. And indeed, there's always scope for efficiencies on the public spending side. We could eliminate many subsidies. For example, public spending on defence could fall, justice could fall. There are other areas that you could find. So partial options on the revenue side would include abolishing tax expenditures. These are highly regressive, things like tax breaks on paying inheritance, various other ones related to property. You could recoup 2 to 3 billion that way overall. You could increase taxes on property. Land tax was mentioned earlier. Wealth taxes were mentioned. We probably need to increase taxes on things like carbon, plastic bags, and so forth. Against that, of course, there are some tax headings which are going to decline. Corporation tax receipts will decline over the next few years, perhaps precipitously. We can also expect to lose receipts from motor tax, petrol and diesel as well, for very good reasons. So ultimately, the issue then becomes a political economy issue in terms of actually achieving a goal of a universal basic income. Ultimately, income tax and VAT increases would be inevitable. VAT, of course, is a regressive tax. So I imagine people on the left in particular would be focused primarily on income tax. Now, obviously, these calculations don't consider any stimulatory economic impacts. So there's a stimulatory boost to aggregate demand from the higher levels of household income. And obviously just a purely mechanical calculation as it did there wouldn't in fact be borne out in reality. There's obviously changes to incentives, there's changes to employment behavior, to whether people take up jobs, whether people invest in themselves. I would imagine a universal basic income would lead to a fairly significant increase in human capital over time. That would lead to an increase in innovation within the economy and productivity and so forth. Michael perhaps might talk about these things in greater depth. Of course, there's cheaper options too. You could, as Guy says, have a basic income price well below the level needed to meet all essential needs. So a much cheaper universal basic income would be much more affordable, or would require would pose less formidable challenges to the body politic in terms of reforms to taxes and reforms to public spending. Obviously, a cheaper option, a cheaper universal basic income would certainly require retention of secondary benefits. There are other options, partial UBI, job guarantee schemes, minimum incomes for all adults, but I would consider those as not necessarily being comparable. They might be useful and valuable in their own right, but they're different things. So UBI is possible, but the fiscal and political economy implications would be formidable. Formidable, of course, doesn't mean insurmountable. And Guy will know that the ILO have done estimates of the cost of UBI at the national poverty line for adults and 50% for children up to 15 years, and came up with a figure of about 28.4% of GDP. We've talked about this from an ethical point of view, and we've talked about the commons. I would argue that universal basic services as well have an ethical basis, and I would see them as part of the commons in terms of everyone should have access to free education, to free healthcare, to free public transport, to free legal services, to free housing, to free childcare, to free adult care. So I would see universal basic services as being something that we should also be striving for. And I suppose the question then is, if we can successfully decommodify these services, we can reduce the significance and importance of market income, of household and individual market income and disposable income. Universal right of access, of course, being on the basis of need then and not ability to pay. So a question that I would have then, and it is a question and not something I have an answer for, is whether the current system would be adequate if we had free health, education and childcare along with heavy subsidization of the other basic services, including housing. And it is just a question. So ultimately for me, the desirability of different welfare state models should be considered in light of what they actually achieve in terms of generating economic and social well-being. So expanding universal basic income or introducing universal basic income or expanding universal basic services would have significant opportunity costs. Doing both together could only happen in the context of significantly higher levels of government revenue, which someone like me might be willing to accept. But obviously from a political economy perspective, it would be difficult to sell, at least in the short term. Could it happen? Yes, I believe that it could. It would obviously be a transformative system break with massive fiscal, social, labor market consequences. But such radical policy shifts rarely occur outside of massive shocks such as war, prolonged recessions, external pressures. So obviously the Beveridge report in the Roosevelt's reforms of the 1930s, the response, the self-preserving response to communism in terms of the creation of the welfare state in the first place. The COVID pandemic has perhaps changed the Overton window or kind of opened it or shifted it a little bit. I think there's a greater acceptance of public spending, less tolerance for the low tax model. I don't doubt that design issues would be difficult. You don't want to undermine existing protections or basic services. You do have to deal with issues about cost of living differences, perhaps, let's say in Dublin versus Donegal, or for renters versus non-renters. Renters have much more significant costs. In terms then of the perspectives of the labor movement overall, Guy will know this, but the Public Service International concluded in 2019 paper that money would be better spent on reforming social protection and building more and better quality public services. But the UK's GMB trade union took a more positive view. Germany's DGB and the ITUC were much more skeptical. But even so, there is that conversation going on there. The Irish Congress of Trade Unions hasn't got an official position on universal basic income. So you know, that space remains to be kind of discussed and fought over. But I suppose I can kind of leave it at that. I'm probably way over 15 minutes, so I apologize if I am. But I suppose the long and short of it is that I don't think that the Irish trade union movement is against a universal basic income. I think the Irish trade union movement doesn't have a position on universal basic income yet. I know that the Irish trade union movement is very, very strongly in favor of universal basic services. So the numbers would have to add up in terms of what does it mean for tax policy and what does it mean for all of that. I know Michael is going to talk about labor market impacts. I could obviously contribute there as well. But I guess for now, I'll leave it at that, and I'm happy to kind of begin the discussion here.
Thanks very much, Tom. Great, very, very thoughtful, very, very helpful, and great to get a sort of a handle on, or at least begin to look at some of the nuts and bolts of the system that have to be tweaked in order to fit this in. And a reminder that yes, the sums have to work, and we have to speak not just to the converted, but to the unconverted. So that's a great intervention there, Tom. Just a reminder there are quite a few questions coming up, and I see now some people are putting them in the Q&A function. I don't know if that's quite the word, but there should be a tab that you could get. If you can put your question and answer in there, it's a lot easier for us to keep track of them and make sure they get answered, because there's other messages in the chat functions. So if you can do that, that would be great. I see some of them are getting answers already. But now I'll hand over. Oh, by the way, we're on good time, Tom. No worries on that. Thank you very much. We're slightly ahead of time. And Michael, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Bobby, and thank you to Basic Income Ireland for inviting me here on this platform with Guy and Tom. You know, there's a narrative out there that all trade unionists are implacably opposed to basic income. There's no doubt that some are, many are. However, I think when we look under the hood, the situation is much more nuanced, more complex, and sometimes just downright messy. In the larger debate, it's sometimes difficult to disentangle when people are responding, whether in support or opposition, to principles or to the pragmatic working out of this policy or that, or responding to the rhetoric. Now, I'll just make 2 points in terms of trade unionists' position on just the principle. First off, trade unions support strong income floors, whether that's in the workplace, through collective bargaining, or through the social protection system. There's a strong current of universalism among trade unions, whether that's through public services or through direct and indirect cash transfers, such as child benefit, free travel passes, etc. These are principles that are shared by supporters of UBI. Indeed, SIPTU's representative on the Arts Recovery Task Force, where we represent thousands of workers in the cultural sector, supported the proposal to trial a basic income among artists and creative workers. So a study commissioned by the TUC, the British Trade Union Congress, stated, if the protagonists sought to discover what unites them rather than divides them, it might lead to a new appreciation of both universal and contributory entitlements as a response to labor market risks. So it's in that spirit I want to highlight 2 areas of concerns for trade unionists and put forward a small, simple little proposal that might kind of bring us together and move in one direction, at least temporarily. There are 2 concerns among trade unionists regarding impacts on the labor market. The first is the impact of UBI on wages and wage determination. The concern is that UBI could potentially suppress wages. Now, we could see how this might happen. With a weekly sum of in excess of, say, 200 euros, people might be tempted to bid themselves into employment, and that bidding could actually go downwards if it's buttressed by a substantial subsidy already in the pocket. Now, the counter argument is that not being financially forced to take up any old work that, regardless of how low it's paid, regardless of how poor the conditions, employers would have to bid up their wages to attract labor. So in that situation, wages would rise. Now, there would seem to be some support for this latter proposition if the reaction of employers to the pandemic unemployment payment is anything to go by. Because we've heard how they're saying that we need to get rid of PUP as soon as possible because we can't get any workers. Workers are content, I don't know, to lounge around all day in their underwear, drinking Red Bull and watching Star Trek reruns. Hey, whatever. Now, whatever about the reality of what the employers are actually describing the situations, there is, of course, a market solution, and that is to increase wages to fill vacancies. Now, of course, wages, it's more than just market reaction of market participants, because the wages are bound up in the wage bargaining model of a particular country. And in this regard, we are at a considerable disadvantage compared to EU countries on the continent. We have one of the weakest collective bargaining laws in Europe. The bargaining power of labor is weak in so many sectors of the economy, especially where it really matters, in the low-paid sectors. So were employers able to seize on UBI to their advantage, workers would have no countervailing power to seize that back. So we can see this kind of either or. The problem is we don't know how the markets and market players will react in the situation where UBI is introduced. The current models cannot predict it, because the current models are based on historical performance, whereas UBI is a significant disruption in the historical performance and represents a significant break with old patterns. The second impact is on employment, and if anything, that's even more difficult to assess. Now, what I find interesting is that in so many results from UBI trials, they all show an increase in entrepreneurial activity. And I think that puts to rest this idea that if you give people money, they'll just lounge around. The fact is, people are very active. Humanity are producers. We like to produce things. So this entrepreneurial activity should lead to increased employment, all the more the case when you consider the progressive impact of the transfers under a UBI, which would largely, well, for the most part, benefit low and average income earners. These are the people, of course, with the higher propensity to spend. This, increase in consumption, again, combined with the increase of entrepreneurial activity under the UBI trials, would suggest that, that we've seen an increase in enterprise creation and employment. However, on the other hand, we are entering into a period of uncertainty, especially with the first stages of the fourth industrial revolution and the proliferation of automation, AI, and robotics. In this situation, the trade union fear is that with job losses or degradation, you could create a two-tier workforce whereby many would find enhanced employment opportunities under this new regime, but many more will be shut out, reliant upon UBI, and that could entrench that two-tier division. And then with fewer income earners, the size of the UBI could become a drag on incomes and economic performance. So trade unions look at other alternatives, such as shorter working hours, expansion of public sector employment, especially in the caring areas, or support for good employment in the market sectors. But again, we don't have a way to gauge which scenario will win out, or what is more likely, the degree to which each scenario will be actualized, but how far they will penetrate into the labor market. As I said, one of the problems in trying to assess this is we don't have the models to do that, or the models that we have would probably not be reliable. Another issue is, and I think that possibly supporters of UBI might want to take this on board, one of the selling points they have is how transformative UBI could be, social, economically, politically, and there's evidence there would be political impacts, and that's true. I mean, they sell that's a positive selling point for UBI. It can also become a barrier because if it takes a considerable amount of investment, not just in resources, but in institutional changes to bring in UBI, what happens if we find that it doesn't work? It would take an equal amount of resources, whether in institutional change, to move back away from UBI, back to the current situation. In other words, because it is a transformative thing to introduce, it's a transformative thing to remove if such a situation down the road were to occur. It's not like water charges. Water charges were introduced, but it had minimal impact in one sense, in the wider political economy, and therefore it was easier to get rid of when people said they didn't want it. So, well, so there's positives and negatives. I prefer to kind of light a candle rather than curse this darkness of conflict and try to find some common ground whereby, or a meeting ground, whereby UBI supporters and skeptics could come together and look at a particular program that might get us down the ways. And I think that I would suggest looking at the concept of participation income. As many will know, this model was proposed by Tony Atkinson as a bridge between universal basic income and the current situation, a bridge to try to get over the moral hazard argument, that if you give people money for doing nothing, an argument that I don't think is really sustainable anyway, but to try to get over that argument, which is a political blockage, and also over the argument of cost, which Tom has outlined. So this would provide a weekly payment to those who participate in society. Employment, those in caring, who are working but are not recognized by the formal economy. That's mostly women who are in caring roles, those who are in full-time education, and those who participate in civil society and add to society's social capital. And the most effective, cost-effective way to kickstart this thing would be to build on a payment that already exists in the Irish system, and that is namely tax credit. There's not, the role and character of tax credits is not fully appreciated in large part because it operates below the radar. We don't actually see it operating, but actually a tax credit is a sum of money that is used to reduce a tax liability. For instance, I'm a low-paid worker earning 25,000 euros. My tax liability is 5,000 euros, being taxed 20%. But then I get these credits, 3,300 euros worth of credits set against that, and my net tax bill is much, much lower. The great thing about tax credit is everybody in employment gets them. So that argument of, basic income is a bad idea because, you're giving the same amount to Michael O'Leary as you're giving to a cleaner. Well, that's what happens with tax credits. That occurs already. Tax credits are essentially a flat rate cash subsidy. It's irrelevant that they're delivered through the tax system. They could be as easily delivered through a same kind of system that universal basic income would operate through. However, there is one major flaw, and that is that people who are below the income tax threshold do not fully receive their tax benefits. And those are people who are low income earners, part-time workers, and a lot of these are single parents, mostly women, because they can't work full-time because of the lack of proper social and community supports. And of course, those on precarious contracts with intermittent income. Those would be the primary beneficiaries. Someone today earning 10,000 euros would see their income go up by nearly 1,500 euros if tax credits were transformed into a basic payment. So that's the suggestion in terms of kickstarting participation income, to turn tax credits into a basic payment. Of course, initially this is limited to those in work. And of course, the tax credit's worth something like 65 euros a week. You can't possibly live on 65 euros a week. But I think as Guy mentioned, and I was struck by that, even a small amount constitutes basic security. And basic security is so important coming into a period where we may be facing greater uncertainty with the climate chaos crisis, industrial revolution, and the prospect of secular stagnation over the long term. So this could actually create a floor, a foundation upon which to build on, because over time, you could increase the value, you could extend it to carers, full-time students, those active in civil society, and eventually to everyone. So this could be the foundation for the evolution of the Irish social protection state. The great advantage of it is this. It is a proposal that does not necessarily have to require people to buy into basic income. Therefore, it can attract basic income supporters who see it as a first step on the way to a universal basic income. while winning support of those who would be critical of basic income, but could see it as an effective reform towards a more effective social transfer system. Now, I know UBI supporters would say, well, still retains conditionality. It doesn't cover the basic living expense. However, I would just point out that even if you were to launch a UBI program tomorrow morning, you would have to phase it in over a considerable period of time. And during that phasing in, there would still be conditionalities and less than optimal payment levels. So it's a space whereby no one is required to give up their ideas about UBI, but it's a space where people could start to work together. Now, the Low Pay Commission will be taking public consultations over the best design, over a basic income trial. They've been mandated by the government to do this. So here could be an opportunity for basic income supporters and skeptics. And in particular, because I come from the trade union movement, I would certainly like to see those who are skeptical and the trade union movement come forward as well, to come together and put forward a concrete participation income trial proposal that could also be applied to the Tax and Social Welfare Commission, who hopefully will be looking at the interaction of tax and social protection. So in doing that, I really believe that we would find that we have much more in common than we think. So thanks, Bobby and Philomena, for inviting me along.
Thanks very much for that, Michael. Great intervention. Very complimentary, I think, to the other two, and very much like the idea of looking at what unites us and how we can move in a direction that, if you like, keeps everybody happy, coming from different perspectives. But we'll come back to that. I think now it's time really to go to the Q&A session, really. And I know some people have been posting them in the Q&A. So I'll run just what I propose to do is here, we just run through, make sure everybody has seen them, just to make sure we're not missing anything. It gives the panelists that they've seen some of them, I think, a time to think about it. And I think there were one or two still in the chat. We'll see if we can pick those up. And I think there's been one answered, but we might remind everybody, just in case not everybody saw that there was at least a response to some of it. So we'll run through what's there first, and then I'll open the floor if anybody wants to do it in the old-fashioned verbal way and see if there's anything there. So, we're in good time for this, so that's very good. And thanks to the speakers for excellent timekeeping there. So the Q&A that we've got that I can see here, and I know I'm being Brad will be my backup just to make sure I see it correctly as host, and Philomena, you can probably see it too. I'm a bit new on the webinar stuff, but the first one's from Anne Ryan. They're about the fact that about BII, basic income, doing the heavy lifting, eliminating poverty, necessary but not sufficient, that none of us claim that it would do all of that. And the question there about Guy's assertion that lower than ideal rate was still about beneficial effects. And I think highlighting the point there about conditionality, we might possibly link that to another question I saw to do with the PUP and the effect of the PUP on people taking up work or not, and the fact that the PUP is a conditional payment. That's the pandemic unemployment payment, for those not familiar with the acronyms in Ireland. Then there's a question from Alex Piggott, which is talking about the calculations and the net cost at a rate of 203 job seekers allowance, giving a net cost of about 6 billion. Not counting certain savings. And just a question for Tom there. It sounds like an arithmetic discussion. Do you see that, Tom, there from Alex?
I'm looking for it now. Sorry,
it's in the Q&A. If you hit the Q&A tab.
Okay, as opposed to chat. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Great.
And then just for liking those. Then there's a question from John Baker about the Commission on Taxation and Welfare. Will it consider basic income? Tom might have a direct answer to that. And Alex, then for Michael, flagging the issue, Alex Piggott flagging the issue of automation and possibly the number of paying jobs decreasing, and UBI as a form of providing securities does precarious work, and just sort of giving people in lower paid work the ability to say no to these lower wages. I think you could possibly covered some of that a little bit, but it's good to have it there. And then I'm just having a quick look. I see 3 questions in the chat. One was to do with inflationary impacts of UBI. I think Guy has already made some response to that, but maybe we, just in case not all of us saw it, reiterate that. And then what would you say to people who would say the UBI, this was the PUP and conditionality aspect, higher job vacancies and people reluctant to take up work? And then the third question there was UBI system about one that includes existing public service areas. And I think my interpretation there is we say that there's certain services would continue and hopefully be increased. Certainly in Basic Income Ireland discussions, we're very much in favour of universal basic services and see universal basic income as part of that. So that may well be a response to that. So they're the questions we've got in, and they're on the screen. So I'll just check now to see if there are any other comments or questions that people want to make, and I guess that means putting your hand up and Brad doing something to allow people to actually speak. So, Guy, are you putting your hand up to reply or to ask a question?
I want to make a comment about something else that's been said, but I don't know how to it other than putting my hand up to indicate to do that.
Okay, well, I'll tell you what, we'll get you to make that comment, and then we'll see what other questions are coming in, and then we'll go around, and once we've got all the questions, we'll go around and then see how we can deal with the questions in terms of response from panelists or maybe other people who are around. So fire away there, Guy, please.
Okay, well, I thought the other 2 speakers were fantastic, so you shouldn't misinterpret what I'm about to say. I find one thing that Michael said, which I've written about and done research on, is the idea that tax credits are a progressive measure. Basically, the system of tax credits that's been developed in the last 30 years or more thereabouts, on both sides of the Atlantic, are regressive instruments. And they are basically similar to the Spinum system of 1795. What the Spinum system was it was conditional. You paid, the parish paid an additional amount, a form of tax credit, for those who took low paid jobs. So they topped it up to a certain level. Well, if you have tax credits based on that just for job holders, then you basically say to the worker and to the employer, we can pay much less, but we'll split the difference because you're going to get your income topped up anyhow by the state, and therefore we can have a low wage, wink, wink, and do it. And I believe that the onset of tax credits since the 1980s have been one of the factors that have depressed real wages in the past 40 years. And that, I think, is a huge error. The second point related to that is that you cannot say a system is universal if it only gives to employees. You have to be in a job to get benefits. And of course, the unions have always supported job holders and not people doing unpaid work, unpaid care work. I've recently got figures from the Office of National Statistics in Britain. The value of unpaid care work in Britain is greater than the value generated by all manufacturing jobs and all non-financial services per year. Now, we don't have a universal system if you just tie benefits to a particular status. That's one thing. The other comment I wanted to make by way of reaction was that we're going through a technological revolution. It's the first technological revolution in history that is generating more work and less labor. Usually it destroys jobs and then leads to destruction and new jobs come up. But what's happening is we not only have automation, which I think many of us should welcome. I want to see all toilet cleaning automated, for example, all street cleaning automated, great. Okay, let's not get our priorities wrong. But we're also seeing what's called heteromation. These new technologies are generating a lot of work that doesn't get counted as work, doesn't get remunerated, is not in our statistics. And I would be more impressed by the unions with whom I've worked for decades in the ILO if they lobbied and campaigned to have a radical overhaul of our labor force statistics so that we have more information on what women are doing, what more men are doing, all that unpaid care work, unpaid voluntary work, essential work. But the fact is that we've marginalized it. It's been a sexist failing for the last 100 years. It is ridiculous. But I think what we have to do is think differently. And that's what I think the automation and the technological revolution is doing. It's increasing inequality. It's increasing rental incomes going to the possession of the intellectual property rights behind the new technology. And it's depressing the share going to people doing labor and work. Those are the phenomena we should address. So I think that we've really got to think somewhat more radically than as if we're still dealing with the labor market of the mid-20th century. That's my feeling on several of those points.
Thank you very much, Guy. That's certainly, we'll get the debate going and food for thought for sure. I can see points nodding, heads nodding there. I'm looking around. Do we have another question has come in? So I'm looking at the questions there, and I thought what we'll do now maybe is just run through the questions and see the panelists. Just check. Michael, Tom, Guy, can you see the questions in the Q&A function there?
Yeah, 7 questions.
Okay, and maybe we'll see. Run through that and see. First of all, is there any volunteer? Any one of you would like to respond to the first one there by Anne?
What's that one?
It's about poverty and UBI as a contribution to that, but fundamentally about the unconditionality aspect, a discussion we've had. Guy, you good? Yeah.
I don't want to hog the response. You'll be losing me soon, so that'll be all right. But I strongly feel that basic income, even on the road to a proper system, gives people more control of their lives. What we found with our pilots, particularly our big pilot in India, is that, as Michael correctly said, all the pilots show that people increase their work when they have basic security. They have more energy, more confidence, they take more risks, and so on. And you're going to have a reduction, not a complete removal, of the extent of poverty traps and what I'd call precarity traps, which act as huge moral hazards, suppressing people's supply of labor to low-wage jobs. So for me, this is critical because I strongly believe, and I think Sean has been saying this for years as well, that it should not be charity. It should be an economic right. It's an economic right for the common justice points. And it shouldn't be conditional. Whatever conditionality, it leads to control of people, it leads to sanctions, it leads to punishment, it leads to moralistic judgments, it leads to a loss of solidarity. And that, I think, has been one of the biggest failures of the left in the last 30 years. They went big time for means testing. Only if you're poor and you prove you're poor will you get anything. And that loses a sense of solidarity. That's an important part of universalism. It's not that everybody gets it, it's the failing that you feel you're part of an economic system based on equal status. And that I think is the answer, basically. We should oppose conditionality, even if it's benign paternalism, which it usually is. Often it isn't benign at all, like with universal credit in Britain. It's certainly not benign. But I think the opposition to conditionality should be fundamental to our campaign.
Right. Thank you very much, Guy. Just as that's a very, well, they're all big points, but would Michael or Tom like to comment on that? That particularly conditionality as is a key feature of that. Tom, you look as if you're ready to say something.
Yeah, no, Bobby. I would see the lack of conditionality as being one of the most exciting aspects of universal basic income. I'm totally against conditionality of any kind and associated with welfare payments. So you're very much preaching to the converted here. I think for all the reasons that you say, and indeed many people don't even avail of their entitlements because of the fear, because of the pejorative kind of shame that's often associated with filling out forms, having to go into an office and to do all of those things. So the lack of conditionality is very much an attractive feature to me.
Good. Michael, do you have a quick comment on that?
Well, yeah, that's why trade unions have, certainly here in Ireland, I would imagine throughout Europe, have campaigned against means testing. Means testing is demeaning. It can sometimes be arbitrary. It can be overly bureaucratic, and too many people fall through the cracks. Which is therefore why trade unions here have supported more universal approaches. Social insurance, to my mind, would be, although there are problems with that. So the issue is not whether we can construct a future without conditionality. I'm sure that's possible. Certainly it would be desirable. The question is on the long-term journey to that, will you have conditionality? And the answer is yes, you will. On those steps that you will have, there will be conditionality. You want to keep eroding it, you want to undermine it, you want to do all sorts of things, but it will be there. Therefore, any type of short-term steps to kick the long-term argument towards a progressive evolution of the Irish social state, if it contains conditionality, that's not a reason to oppose it. Because I think we need to accept that not only will you have small payments at the beginning, you will also have those elements of conditionality. The question is not whether you have that, say, for instance, in a kind of participation income proposal that I proposed based on transforming tax credits into a basic payment. That the question is not therefore whether it has conditionality, but whether that is part of the process to undermine the very concept of conditionality going towards the long term.
Okay, thanks for that. I think that's, I mean, we can see a common position, if you like, coming here, that we seem to have in danger of very vehemently agreeing that conditionality is something we shouldn't have. We should work for an unconditional payment. The issue is how to get there. So and no doubt that will continue, but
and I suppose the issue is, I mean, it's all well and good talking to each other, but we're not the ones we have to convince in terms of the conditionality. I mean, you see the attacks from the right-wing media, from small businesses, from all of these things that wish to attach conditionality. And I suppose this is the value of a pilot. The value of a pilot is that it can show that people do not, as Michael says, or one of you said, play on your Nintendo or something like that all day and drink Red Bull or whatever it might be. And look, the reality is, before all of these arguments about young people being, lazy or whatever, really reared their heads in 2008, 2009 during the great financial crash, and have reared their heads again almost instantaneously with the pandemic unemployment payment. And it was notable that it was young people in particular that were targeted as being lazy, not older people, heaven forbid. But the thing is, we had full employment prior to 2008. People were willing to work, but then you get these high rates of unemployment, and the victim effectively is blamed. So I think all the pilots that Michael and Guy have pointed out that have happened around the world, which have shown that there have been no negative employment impacts, and as Michael says, have increased entrepreneurial activity, and I believe the ability to not take a bad job will allow people to actually invest in themselves, and that will improve human capital in the long run. But that, of course, could be interpreted sometimes as being lazy, because you're not immediately taking a job, or you're not immediately going into education. And of course, people's caring responsibilities or mental health issues or whatever it might be are their own business, but that will often be interpreted as laziness. But so I think it's always going to be an issue. I think the right-wing media are always going to portray it as such, and right-wing political parties. And I guess I think that's why the pilots, and having a pilot in Ireland would be so valuable, because it would at least provide an empirical basis for us to make judgments about how people do respond. But the pilot has to go on for a significant period of time. It can't be something that goes on for a few weeks or even a few months. It has to be something that is a significant period of time. So I'm going on now. So
yeah, no, that's good, Tom. I'm just conscious that partly I know Guy's going to have to leave us. And we've got a couple of other questions. Some are very much for us to discuss, like the arithmetic of the Irish system. I think we can have that. I was just saying, is there anything else we could get a comment on, or anything you fancy commenting on, Guy, before you go, or and then we can continue discussion for the remaining few minutes, because I know you have to get out.
Yeah, I suppose I should try to go, having said something really controversial. I don't like the rhetoric and the design of what is called universal basic services. I believe in public services. I believe in good public services, and we need them. There's no question about that. But when you use the word universal basic services, what services are we talking about? First service is the provision of food. So I've looked at the literature with the people advocating universal basic services, and they advocate 1 free meal a day if your income is below X. That's not universal, not a service really. It's a form of charity, not a service at all. Well, do we want universal food banks where we all queue up and we get standard fuel? I worked in the Soviet Union, and I've seen how that system worked. It was terrible. Same with something like water. I believe that water should be nationalized and mutualized, so it's controlled by unions and other groups. But shouldn't we have a price mechanism? Because if you don't, then there are moral hazards. People leave the taps on, they squander it, and they don't preserve the resources. It's free good. It's a free good. There are certain things that should be priced. And that's why a basic income with public services, yes, you can have sensible prices, but you give people access to services, and that's critical. At the moment, we have the worst of all possible worlds, because we've got privatized services run by private equity funds, which, as we've seen all over Europe during the pandemic, has resulted in thousands more deaths in care homes than should have been the case. So we're a long way from where we should be. But I don't think that the panacea of universal basic services should be counterposed with a basic income. They deal with different issues. And I would like people to be more specific about what their basic services they're proposing. Bus services is usually the transport one. Why? Why penalize someone who wants to take the tube or go by bike, etc.? So I don't think that UBS is a real alternative to basic income.
Okay, thanks for that, Guy. I can imagine it certainly will help get a discussion going. And
well, let me end by saying thank you very much for letting me speak. Great. The other two speakers made some fantastic points, and the questions, comments, fantastic. So I wish you every success, everybody. and have a good evening. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Guy.
Bye, Guy.
Have a good evening too. Take
Good night.
care. Bye.
Goodbye.
Do you want to take
Bobby?
it, Michael?
Bobby, could I just come in on? Unfortunately, Guy has left.
Yes,
Michael,
unfortunately. Yes,
yeah,
please,
but
Michael.
he's very, I mean, he has a very challenging perspective, and I think that's, it's the debate is more valuable because of that. However, I would just point out that in the issue of kind of universal basic services, or in the old language, good public services, proper public services, there is an absolute need to invest in that. We are a chronic low spender on public services. We do not have free healthcare. We do not have free GP care. We do not have heavily subsidized prescription medicine. There is not only just the issue of access to services by making them free, or at least well below the market rate. There is more than just the issue of access, though that is vitally important, especially if you're sick or your child, you want to send your child to school or anything like that. There's also an income enhancement to universal public services. One example, if you have a child, it's going to cost you 200 euros a week in childcare for full day care. That's the average, a little under 200 euros a week. The average in the EU countries, which treat childcare as a public service, we don't here, but they do there, it's 60 euros a week. So you do two things with proper public services. You not only grant access to households that cannot afford childcare in the current system, but you also reduce the fee by 160 euros, about 140 euros a week. Multiply that now by 52 weeks. That's a huge income transfer benefiting primarily low and average income earners. So there's I think that we shouldn't oppose the two, but let's also accept that basic services is more than just access, although that is key. It also is an income enhancement, just like basic income, to those who participate them, basically helping low and average income earners.
Yeah.
And look, if I can just add to that,
Yep.
I mean, obviously universal basic services and universal basic income are competing because they both have a fiscal cost. And again, to have both together, you would quite significantly have to increase taxes. And I for what it's worth, I didn't mention food or water. I mentioned healthcare, which of course is free in the UK, education, childcare, elder care, legal services, and indeed, yes, public transport, which obviously we want people to be taking as part of the commons. We want people to be using public transport and to be reducing their emissions. And that is the only solution for people in rural Ireland, the only alternative until everyone has their heavily subsidized electric vehicle. So, and yes, I do think that healthcare, education, adult care, childcare, legal services access should not be determined by the price mechanism. So I disagree with Guy on that. I think universal basic income has a lot to be said for it, but there is no silver bullet policy that will solve all issues. And universal basic services have a very, very important, and I would argue fundamental place in a modern 21st century society. And just being in favor of universal basic services does not make you against the universal basic income.
Yeah, and I think that, Tom, just to maybe pull that together and then move on to some of the other questions, I mean, that's a discussion we've had internally, and our position, broadly speaking, has been universal basic income as part of the universal basic services package, and definitely not counterposing them at all. But there is a more nuanced discussion that we could go on with. But that's great. It's good to get that stimulation. Now let's have a quick look in the few minutes remaining there. There was the one by Alex there to do with the actual working out of the figures. Do you see that, Tom?
I do, maybe if you want to give me Alex's details, we can. I know we're almost up to 7:30 about the specific costs. I haven't seen analysis about EBI causing savings in health, justice, social protection, etc. So that would be interesting to look at.
And Social Justice Ireland have been doing arithmetic as well. It would be good to, if there's one good thing we can do at the end of that, is take that discussion forward outside of here, because I think listening to people discussing arithmetic is great for engineers like myself, but not for anybody else. Maybe economists too. Okay, so we'll take that elsewhere.
Yeah, John Baker, I see as a question as well, and well, I don't have an answer for that yet. But the remit is to look at all aspects of taxation and welfare. So at least it is capable of being considered, and I can certainly say that it would be brought up. Whether it will be, how heavily it'll be knocked back by other members of the commission, I cannot say, but I can ensure it'll certainly be debated.
Maybe something we need to follow up, actually, as the people working for basic income. We need to talk maybe to you.
Well, I imagine there will be an opportunity to make submissions to the commission over the next year, and look, obviously I'll make sure that basic income are fully aware of when that opportunity arises.
Okay. I'm looking through them quickly, and I know Philomena has the unenviable task of making notes to try and pull key points up, so we want to make sure we've time for that.
Well, there is a point there, Bobby, about automation. It's something Guy mentioned as well. Alex is saying that with automation, we will see the overall number of paying jobs decrease with a knock-on effect of decreasing wage rates. But actually, we've been making that argument has been made for over 2 centuries now, longer arguably. And what happens is, yes, in some sectors there are job losses, but overall the industrialized economies of the last 200 years have continued to generate more jobs, albeit in different sectors. So yeah, there will be job losses in particular sectors, areas like manufacturing, for example, but they have generally been replaced by other jobs. In the West, that has been from agriculture to industry to services now. And in the future, I think it'll be more towards face-to-face and tactile services involving caring and so forth. But I'm not convinced that overall aggregate employment in the economy will decline. It may do, but the evidence is still out on that one yet. So that's all I would add there.
Great, thanks. I think we'll just skipping through. That's very good, Tom. The question for Guy, he's gone now. We could always follow up afterwards. I think the next one is for Michael there. Do you see that from Dave Quinn about refundable tax credits? Do you see that, Michael? Do you want to respond quickly on that?
Do you see any provision for tax allowances, pension contribution deductibles be included in some form also? Well, of course, the debate around secondary tax credits is a separate debate from personal tax credit. The reason why I use personal tax credit is everybody gets them, whether employed or employee or self-employed. They are given to every taxpayer, which means every income earner. The issue with, and a lot of basic income models actually, raise the revenue through the elimination of many secondary tax relief, like pension contributions, health expenses relief, etc. And therefore, no one gets any type of relief whatsoever. I think that generally speaking, we would want to move towards a situation of reducing the level of tax expenditure through tax reliefs in the economy. They distort markets. They generally favor higher income groups. You can see that with pension contribution. I think you eventually want to phase them out, though whether you can abolish all of them is questionable, and want to give direct support for economic and social activities which are beneficial, to a wider group. So in that sense, they're different than personal tax credits. They've been used to supplement, they've been used to kind of promote or protect certain activities. That would best be done through direct expenditure rather than tax reliefs, because you have greater control over it. And you could actually say, okay, well, this up to a certain limit, or no, this is not actually economically or socially beneficial. It's just a tax credit we've had around for a long time and nobody's bothered to do anything about it. Oh.
Okay, thanks, Michael. I guess, again, the debate could go on quite a bit. There's a comment here from Paul Holden about the economic model and perpetual growth and how sustainable would be. And I think there's a follow-on from Paul there, and I think that's a very big question. And I know one that a colleague organization in this that does a lot on FASTA who are looking at that. Anybody want to make a quick comment on that, as time is now running out?
Yeah.
But,
I mean, look, the economic model that we have cannot be based upon perpetual growth from ongoing and increasing use of resources. So we cannot put more capital or land or natural resources or labor into the system. Eventually, they run out. Even if there weren't implications for the planet. So the only way that you can sustain what we call growth, or if you prefer output, growth is actually a very unfortunate word here, because it has all sorts of connotations, and mathematically it's impossible. But if to increase output sustainably, the only way you can do that is through knowledge and innovation. So and by doing things more efficiently. So you generate more output for a given level of input. So if through that model, which is based upon education and research and development and knowledge transfer, that way you can continue to make your economy stronger and your society stronger and improve well-being. But you absolutely, but Paul is absolutely right. You cannot continue to grow indefinitely using more resources. So the only way you can sustainably grow long term is through new ideas.
Okay.
Essentially.
Thanks, Tom. Maybe we'll move to the next one and see, Michael, would you like to have a quick comment at the one from Alex Piggott about universal services, the model of a three-legged stool?
Okay, whatever it is.
It's basically roof over their heads, homes, it's health and universal basic income as a three-legged stool.
Yeah,
and
but
the idea that we work on.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing. Well, yes, I mean, let's really firm up that stool and put in a couple more legs, you know. But I take the principle. The principle is correct. However, and I think also the principle is correct is that different UBI models are not necessarily inconsistent with various UBS models. You know, income security, a strong income floor should be coupled with, you know, strong access to public services, however we express that. However, I think as Tom pointed out, you know, we do live in a world of limited fiscal resources. And that is going to, you know, that is going to occur for a long time. And unfortunately, when you have limited fiscal resources, you have to prioritize your choice. So is the choice to give everybody a basic income of say 200 euros a week, or is it to ensure everybody gets free healthcare and truly free education? Because I mean, Tom is right. Education is going to play. It plays an important role now, even more important in the future. Now, I don't think these are either or. You say, okay, we can have a strong income floor, may not be UBI. We can have this with public services. This is particularly important. Healthcare, obviously, one of those is vitally important. Having a house over your head that you can afford is also vitally important. But the problem is you have to make choices. In a fiscally constrained world, you have to make choices. And I'm not sure you can do both UBS and UBA.
Great. Okay. Thanks. Again, we could go on. I think there was a question there. The last one I see was to do with Dave Quinn on costings and proposals. And knowing Dave, I'm sure he wouldn't mind if we say, let's put that one into the arithmetic discussion that we probably might need to have a separate chat on outside of here, because we're also now over time. And I know it's really important that we close it. And what I would like to do is, before we do the final closing, hand over to Philomena, who has the lovely task of trying to pick out just some of the key points there. So over to you, Philomena.
Thank you. Right. This was a fantastic evening, some great points raised. Just kind of one of the key takeaways is that there would be greater freedom for workers. There would be the freedom to say no to unsuitable jobs. there'd be greater bargaining power, there'd be greater security, you could walk out of a job you didn't want. And as we've seen from the PUP payment, you know, the employers would need to increase their wages to try and attract workers if there was UBI implemented, and it must be introduced as a package in addition to other universal basic services such as healthcare. However, this would require very high taxes, and it is affordable. However, you know, we need increased income taxes, increased VAT, wealth taxes. But we're at the point where UBI is being publicly discussed both nationally and internationally. We've Andrew Yang's campaign in the US, we've Gart's basic income pilot in Ireland. And I suppose the current social welfare system is not meeting the goals of elimination of poverty and deprivation. So there's this big need for basic income. And we're at an important time in history where there is a real need for UBI because of increased automation, jobs coming obsolete, and even a small basic income could make a huge difference to people's lives, people who are on the margins. And of course, that can be built upon. And so it's just overall, it just gives people more control of their lives, the elimination of conditionality associated with the current system. So
thanks very much, Philomena. It was a huge number of points to cover, so we will be taking forward them anyhow and digesting them afterwards. And I think just to say thank you to our speakers for making the time available and the thinking that went behind it and engaging in a debate, which was good. We might have a few provocative comments there, but that's always good to make sure we're all staying awake and engaging. And I'd like to say also thanks to Philomena herself, who did a lot of the work behind the scenes getting this going. So thanks, Philomena. And Philomena's recently come on as joint coordinator and then took this one on. So baptism of fire, well done. And thanks to Brad for the hosting and technical behind the scenes. And finally, thanks to all the participants who gave up an hour and a half of their evening, their summer's evening, almost midsummer, to come along. And hopefully this will both inspire us in terms of working for, I think, what we have a common view for, but also recognizing the challenges and the necessity of doing the detailed work to work out how to get there and to achieve what we all seem to want anyhow, which is a way of improving conditions for everybody in Ireland and sustainably. So with that, I think we can close and go, and well, we can't go to the pub together, but we can go virtually. So enjoy your evening and thank you very much.
Thank you, Bobby.
Bobby, thanks, Philomena and Brad.
Thank you.